We can start.
Yeah. So good afternoon for people in India, and good evening, good morning, good day for people wherever else you all are. Um, my name is Prasad Shetty, and I'm one of the teachers at the School of Environment and Architecture, which is organizing this symposium. Uh, we'll this symposium will go on from 1 p.m., which is right now, to 9 9:15 in the evening, India time. And there are 4 sessions, one on inhabitation and housing, the first one, the second one on drawing and visual culture and image making, the third one on environment and ecology, and the fourth one on technology, uh, and also probably new media. So there are 4 sessions, and there are people from all over the world, I must say, who are in conversation with people from our from the school. So welcome everybody uh, um, uh, to these conversations. I'll just take 5 to 7 minutes to kind of locate what is post institution all about, and what is to be expected, and what are the broad tones one should kind of locate these discussions in. Uh, so last year during this week, our annual conference was called Songs of Turbulence. Uh, and that was held against the backdrop of a protest around questions of citizenship. This year, this symposium, post institution, is set up against the backdrop of another protest around the questions of protection for pastoral economies. And between these two protests was the year of the virus, and that virus which brought humanity to its knees. And as the pandemic took over the world, the fragility of the modern institutional frameworks that hold humanity, the fragility of that framework became very clear. Things started crumbling. The education, health, governance system showed their fragilities and mortalities even. The most telling image of the symptoms were those of people who fled cities in millions, undertaking journeys of several hundred kilometers and not knowing what lays ahead. They were literally running for their lives, and none of the systems held them. Now, we didn't have systems to hold them, protect them, to kind of uh, uh, provide them anything. And further, there has been no account so far of what happened to these lives. I mean, there are few stories here and there, but there is no consolidated account. Our own system of operation, that is the education system, where we are located as C, has been showing cracks since quite some time now. The model that got consolidated looked at academia as a skilling or a preparatory place, and not as an academic space. The academic institutions seem to have forgotten their role in imagining new worlds, providing new conceptualizations, and creating new possibilities through experimentations and explorations. Their trajectories seem to have been taking them towards becoming super successful coaching classes, where examination became the most important things. So when the pandemic happened here, and it happened, and the close down happened March 17th last year, the only thing my university here was worried about seemed to be about conducting exams. and conducting exams in a way where people do not copy. And then, of course, there were a ridiculous series of innovations to make sure that that students don't copy using these multiple cameras and monitoring systems. Ridiculous. Meanwhile, the past decade or so has created an interestingly digitally enabled ecosystem for autodidacts. The best teachers and skill trainings are available online. The role of teacher, classroom, and institutional framework seem to be increasingly destabilizing. There are people learning all kinds of things, making all kinds of networks, creating their own audiences and markets, and also forging new alliances and friendships. If the 20th century was controlled by techno-legal cartographies of law and accounts, the various algorithmic frameworks of the 20th century seem to open the world for many others. Of course, there are monopolistic experiences and several dimensions of the self under threat. But the foundations of the techno-legal cartographies are being shaken for sure. So at sea, while these emerging conditions, that of the fragility of modern institutions, the collapse of academic space, the digitally enabled ecosystem for autodidacts, while these emerging conditions are being very closely observed, we've also been doing two things, and particularly in the last 2 years. First, at reconstituting ourselves institutionally, and second, interrogating the current coordinates of architectural education. I'll spend just one more minute in explaining this. We decided to reconstitute ourselves to reclaim academic space. We decided to establish ourselves as a set of practices instead of being a preparatory institute. So C today is formed out of the practices of its people. And these are academic practices. That which are interested in interrogation, experimentation, and exploration, and not in reproduction. This space is expected to create an ecology for thinking in new ways about the world and generating new ways to engage with it. That is our reformulation as an academics as an institutional reconstitution. And along with this restructuring, intense interrogation of the frameworks that have
I think we lost Prasad. Prasad, you're on mute. You're on mute.
You're on mute.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I think somebody kind of threw me out and got me in. Anyways, this throwing out and getting in is becoming more and more interesting nowadays. So so along with the restructuring, the institutional restructuring that I was talking about, where we see ourselves as a set of practices, we are also kind of undertaking interrogation of the frameworks that have shaped architectural education so far. And these are, so our faculty members are involved in long-term research engagements in the areas of inhabitation, drawing an image, environment and context, and technology. So these are the four areas of research that we've kind of undertaken. There are plenty of things that have been formulated so far. The first compilation of these will be released as a publication by the end of this year itself. The primacy of the object of a house in the question of inhabitation. Orthographic thinking in drawing and image making. Looking at the environment as an object that needs to be saved. And the industrially shaped ideas of technology, the industrial ideas of technology are all being very, very seriously interrogated. We hope that these interrogations will internally reconstitute the form and matter of architectural education and shake off the slumber in which they have been so far, actually. So while Songs of Turbulence took note of the internal energies of the fluxes that were taking place in the world, post institution is the first step to engage with these energies. So in this symposium, the people from C will be in conversation with other super interesting people. Gautam and Vishwanath are already here, whose work we admire a lot, and who've been thinking, who've been our thinking companions also. We hope that these conversations will provide some clues to think about the new coordinates for architectural academia. Thank you very much and welcome again. I'll now invite Shreyank to kind of, open the first session around inhabitation. Thank you very much. Shreyank.
Thanks, Prasad. I'll just quickly share my screen before. One second, let me see if I can do that. Sorry, I was thrown out again. I don't know. Just 1 second, just let me see if this works now.
You also seem to have landed back in your room from outer space.
So let me. So welcome everyone to this first panel discussion of this day-long symposium titled Post Institution. A very warm welcome to our panelists. It's a pleasure to have you over, and thank you for taking out time and agreeing to be part of this conversation. Before I introduce the panelists, please allow me 10 to 15 minutes to set the background for this panel discussion. The intention of this background introduction is to welcome the audience who have joined us on a Saturday afternoon's lunch hour into the space of this discussion, and to help us be more or less on the same page in order to have a more engaging session. What I will do is offer a jump cut timeline of key ideas that have prevailed in the housing discussion over the last 100 years, if not longer, and some of the key variations. I will then locate the framework within which the pedagogy of housing is carried out even today, and from there we can move into the panel discussion and try to figure out ways to depart from the established framework, as Prasad just mentioned. The panel discussion will be done in a roundtable format, which will go on roughly for an hour, and then we open the last 20 to 25 minutes for questions and comments from the audience. I request you all to keep posting your comments and questions in the chat box below. Go next, yeah. Something is not working. Yeah. Since the symposium at large is thinking about the idea of autodidacts, I am reminded particularly of two autodidacts from the 20th century, Le Corbusier and Patrick Geddes. Both in a way representative of two extreme positions that modern thinkers have taken about the city and particularly about housing. As it is well known, Corbusier professed the controversial idea of tabula rasa, to get rid of the old in order to make way for modern forms of living, which is soaked in the trust in progress and modern technology. On the other hand, Patrick Geddes, coming from a more empathetic background, trained as a biologist and sociologist, was interested in the way people made cities, made place, the ways in which they occupied space, and how modern amenities can be incorporated in the existing settlements without disrupting the existing forms of life. 100 years later, the scenario is not very different. We are still oscillating between mass-produced modern housing or improving living conditions in existing settlements. Mid-1900s oscillated between slightly different set of ideas. The operational idea for that period was the idea of transition, whether it was a transition from rural forms of living to urban forms of living, from rural forms of houses to urban forms of houses, the transition from the house to the veranda, the street, the community space, and the city at large. Works of architects like Charles Correa, B.V. Doshi, Raj Reval, and many other architects engaged in the housing board at that moment was representative of this thinking. 1990s onwards, we were once again oscillating between the questions of urban renewal and in situ improvements, with an occasional and handful cases of conservation of housing stock. We see here how the discussions of housing have always oscillated between these two ideas set out works of Corbusier and Patrick Ellis. A lot of the imagination of housing is usually based on something called a census or population count. Take, for example, the well-known Kundu Committee report of 2012, which projected the housing shortage in India at roughly 19 million households, where 80% of the housing shortage is located in something called as congested households. The idea of congested household is defined as any household that has more than two families sharing one room in a house. By doing this, the report does two things. It keeps nuclear family as the basic unit of housing supply, and two, it presents housing shortage as a gigantic monolithic figure of roughly 15 million families, a monolith that has to be dragged by the state and the market and installed in impossible sites at all cost. Most of the housing policies and affordable housing projects are being developed and driven by this imagination. The discussion by architects over the last 100 years and the imagination of housing framed or interpreted from census tell us that the discussion of housing appears to be working with the three intersecting frameworks of affordability, habitability, and tenure security. These discussions propel the idea of housing as a commodity, shortage of which can be solved only by manufacturing housing as quickly, efficiently, as cheaply as possible. To move away from the monolithic projection of housing supply is one of the first coordinates of this panel discussion. Even if you look at the experience of addressing housing shortage in Mumbai, we know that in the last 20 odd years, even with some of the most generous housing policies and regulatory frameworks, the city has failed to even come close to fulfilling the housing shortage in the city. The target sites of these housing interventions in Mumbai have broadly been located in these four kinds of settlements, whether it is old dilapidated housing stocks, slums, cooperative housing societies built in the 60s and 70s, and urban villages in the city. The dilapidating conditions of these sites are putting them under tremendous pressure to work with redevelopment, with the model of redevelopment in the absence of alternative imagination. Meanwhile, people in these settlements have developed new practices, and there is a context of repair and retrofitting and expansion. Our own research done by the students and my colleagues at the school informs that a whole ecology and a range of practices and networks of repair, retrofit, and expansion have emerged across these settlement types. That is the second coordinate to keep in mind, broadly speaking, that a set of new practices are emerging across the city to kind of, cope with this idea of housing shortages as such. The second site where C is engaged in housing studies is the transforming urbanization of second cities, particularly in the southern states of India. Second cities are becoming favorable sites for new economies to settle, whether it is the startup-related economies, new universities, specialized coaching classes, new industries, yoga tourism, retirement communities, etc. And in response to this, a whole range of housing forms are emerging across these cities. And also in response to the wide range of demands that one sees that this new form of urbanization is bringing with it. Not only that, new forms of living are also intersecting with these new forms of housing, which call for thinking of new questions and ideas about housing from and for these cities. The intersection of plurality of housing forms, forms of living, forms of inhabitation, emerging in response to emerging urbanization will be the third coordinate of this panel discussion. So the three coordinates so far that we have seen is that mass production of housing is not the way forward to address the housing shortage. Second, housing is being produced by and with several localized networks and forms of practices. Hence, the need to think about and with various forms of practices that are producing housing today. Multiple forms of housing are being produced in response to emerging urbanization conditions of cities. Hence, the need to situate the housing question within the question of urbanization, and the need to pay attention to new forms of housing being produced and the forms of lives possible in such housing, broadly various forms of various practices of inhabitation. What about the pedagogy of housing? If the questions of housing since the 1960s have been located in the framework of rights, then new questions of housing since at least 2 decades have been located in the questions of practices and claims. Pedagogy of housing appears to be located in the frameworks defined and consolidated by the mid 1900s, if not earlier. What remains addressed are the new questions of practices of claims, homemaking, domesticity, gender practices, and so on. This is the fourth coordinate for the panel discussion, and perhaps the most important one for us as people in the academia. How can the pedagogy of housing move out of the questions of quantity and into the questions of practices? Our panelists today are engaged in one way or another in shifting the pedagogy of housing in these directions. On the panel, we have Gautam Bhan from IHS, who is a senior lead academics and research at the Institute of Human Settlements, Bangalore. He teaches and researches urban housing, social protection, and urban theory. He's most recently the co-editor of the Companion to Planning in the Global South and author of In the Public's Interest, Evictions, Citizenship, and Inequality in Contemporary Delhi. As a footnote, Gautam comes from an empirical approach to the questions of theory of housing and urban practices in the broadest sense. His work has constantly interrogated the givenness of urban theory while advocating a more grounded approach to the production of theory from and for Indian cities. Needless to say, he's one of the most well-known housing scholars from India. Welcome, Gautam. We have with us Vishwanath Kashikar, or Kashi as the students fondly refer to him. Vishwanath is an associate professor at CEPT. He's interested in clarity and precision. Over the past 10 years, as a full-time faculty member at the Faculty of Architecture, having taught most courses at the undergraduate program, he has developed an interest in architectural education. He has been part of many curricular revisions at CEPT and now conducts teachers training workshops and curriculum revision workshops across the country. He is particularly keen on studying the gap between teaching and learning. Vishwanath is also interested in urban housing. His research focuses on studying the role of architecture in the current housing scenario in India. Through courses on housing design in India and national and international workshops, he attempts to explore the limits of architectural design in housing. Again, on a side note, we at the school, like Prasad already mentioned, have been following Vishwanath's studio at CEPT, broadly titled Oikopolis, where he is exploring ways of reconceptualizing the idea of housing by interspersing the dominant mode of housing production with questions of home, memory, problems of standardization, and potentials of flexibility in apartment types and the ways of engaging with these. From the School of Environment and Architecture, I have my colleague Vastavikta Bhagat, who's focusing on spatial and environmental politics surrounding post-intensive mining landscapes and climate change in Indian cities. She's currently researching a wide range of household experiences and responses to wetness in suburban Mumbai. I am Shriyank Kemlapure. I teach at the School of Environment and Architecture, and together with Rohit Muzumdar, anchor the Housing Research Cluster at C. I welcome you all. With this, I'll lead into the first question of the conversation. Now that we understand housing is a question of small, incremental, transient, and multiple practices, how can we fold this understanding into the pedagogy of housing? May I ask Gautam to break the ice and start the conversation?
Sure, happy to. So thanks a lot, Shriyank, for that overview. And it's a pleasure to be here. I think among friends and colleagues, but particularly at a C conference. And I think I think it's an institution that, precisely because of the way Prasad described it as moving towards a set of practices instead of just professional preparation, I think is something that a lot of us take an enormous amount of inspiration and solidarity from in thinking about pedagogy and teaching. So just to mark a congratulations to C for the annual conference again, and thank you for having me. So, I think in terms of this one question about thinking about how to teach these questions of small and incremental transit, and this notion of incrementality in housing, let me say. So the first thing that I'd like to say is, I think it's really important that one locates this question of incrementality not just as a housing question, but as a fundamental part of thinking about the urban question, at least in Indian cities, but as much as I think would be part of what is increasingly thought of as theory from the urban South. And I say that because I think what's really pivotal is to understand this notion of incrementality, which I think has a more philosophical provocation to the imagination of design per se, and planning per se, as something that actually is part of the production of all urban space. And so one of the things that I just asked that becomes important is that in thinking about incrementality, it is important that students are equally asking about incrementality within a formal corridor project of new urbanization, within a large transportation mega project, within, to not just think of incrementality as the space of, for example, low-income housing, or, the margins of auto construction, or the notion of quote unquote the slum. So to, take that notion where informality, like it used to do, holds this kind of parallel, marginal, ephemeral, everyday space. But then there is also the real work, right? There is what would call professional work. There is the building of projects and are legible and formal. The truth is they're not. That kind of incrementality is absolutely part of all production of all urban systems within Indian urbanization. And our cities are produced through these practices. And the question of time, which is so central to the question of planning and design, I think is not self-evident in the Indian context, right? So when we write about the mega project in infrastructure, we call it stalling and blockade and delay, right? So if you're thinking about housing in India, the fact that, for example, in the recent UP court case, a delay of 9 years for the delivery of housing projects led to a complete reimagination of the formal real estate sector. I mean, so not only, so one, I think this breaking of incrementality as a way to understand the urban condition and to understand housing at all scales across this notion of formal, informal, which I think is a real division that is now beginning to do us conceptual harm in what it obscures and what it sets up. And then if we think of it that way, I think it allows us to again say, how do all forms of housing in Indian cities get put together, right? And they incrementally get put together. How do they escape our intentions? How do they escape the project and the plan and the Gantt chart? And to do it in a way that anticipates this incrementality, as opposed to is surprised by it or tries to document it as what happened outside the norm. And I think that specifically for me in housing, one of the things that this becomes really important then is it means that you focus on the processes of the production of forms we call housing, as opposed to focus on the intention to deliver complete forms of housing, right? So the minute we focus on it as a production, as opposed to kind of a supply chain, then the interest is who is the actor, who's producing, how are they doing it, and what does it mean? Who can produce? Who produces from where? Right? So who is the developer trying to produce an affordable housing PPP in the peri-urban fringe of Nagpur? And who is the kind of urban worker who's trying to occupy land and continue to enter into some kind of incremental squatting type housing relationship here? And who is the person who used to have a formal job and lives in a chawl, but that chawl is transitioning, and so therefore that structure looks formal, but what's happening there? So if we start talking about who is producing, right, instead of saying who is demanding, and I think that move from who is demanding to who is producing allows the focuses on the practices of how housing forms in India are actually produced. But I think it's really important to do that across scale and across formal and informal. I really want studies of incrementality to study formal real estate projects on the Delhi-Agra highway, as much as I wanted to study the peri-urban village and the informal settlement slum. And a final point, I think, for this thing for me then, is then it means to me that one of the key questions of how to teach incrementality in housing is for a period of time for the production of these archives, of the tales of these practices. What do these production look like? What are these archives? I'll give you 2 examples of what we have been doing to have material to teach with. One of them is to look at the ways in which rental housing is getting created in the peri-urban expansion of cities like Coimbatore and Trichy. And that is to really ask this question of the production of rental housing, informal rental housing at a particular price point, right? Who's producing it, who's making it, how are they designing it? what's happening there, and then having a counterpoint to studying an established industrial area like Pina in Bangalore and see what's the production of the form of rental housing there. Right? So there's that emphasis. The second one is to look at, in the Delhi context, we've been doing work that looks at what happens when you get that 18 to 25 square meter plot in a resettlement colony in Delhi in the mid 2000s. Over 10 years, how do people build? What's the pace of that incrementality? What's this materiality, right? Here again, you have the production of housing, but not within auto construction and informality as squatting, but within auto construction, within legality, right? Because the resettlement colony is legal, the plot is legal, you have the license, it's your space, you have no tenure and security. Why then do you take the time you take? Why then are the phases of incremental building the way they are? So what are the ways in which, if I give you a legal plot for 25 square meters, why do different families take completely different timelines to produce their housing? What does that mean about what housing is to them as part of a life trajectory, a developmental trajectory? Again, all of what you're saying, it takes away from the house, the unit, the supply, the commodity. But this is housing as time, housing as part of a developmental life cycle. This is housing as part of a political economy. So in one way, when we separate housing from the house, we have to reinsert it in other registers. Housing as a diagnostic archive of the political economy of an urbanizing small city. Housing as the archive of the life cycle of a working family in an Indian city as they balance whether I give the money to put children in an English-speaking private school or make one wall pakka. Right? What does that trade-off look like when housing is actually cut off against education, where it's a trade-off of household investment? So I think that once we reinsert housing instead of houses and focus on building these archives of production at various scales, we will then begin to get a very different sense of housing, where the incrementality will be embedded because it is part of larger Indian urbanization, not just because we're studying housing as something incremental, whereas infrastructure or transport systems are not studied as incremental. So that's the kind of opening kind of push that I wanted to.
Thanks for that, Gautam. I think it's very important to really kind of shift away, like you're saying, and think about incrementality as a kind of a larger conceptual idea to look at urbanization process itself. Vishwanath, can I ask you to go next, and then maybe Vastavita with her, and then I'll join.
Sure, sure. Uh, well, I would like to take this question and sort of unpack it. And to me, the two keywords here are housing and teaching, because that and what is our imagination of teaching, which I think ties back to what Prasad was talking about institutions in the beginning, and of course the question of housing, because that is what this panel is about. So I think, to me, one of the first problems, and I will speak, of course, primarily from architecture design school perspective. To me, one of the first problems of framing it as a housing problem is that it assumes that the housing or the house stands in opposition to the workplace. So we are taking the industrialization era notion of sort of separating the home from the workplace, and therefore saying that the home is primarily a space of consumption and the workplace is primarily a space of production, which is not true in most Indian cities, right? And in many strata of society, that the home and the workplace is not different. Uh, so to me, the first problem that I see in design schools is the moment it is framed as a housing question, we immediately jump into mass housing as a building typology. So to me, the first question is, can we stop framing projects in school from a function-based type understanding of the city, and look at other ways of classifying building types, if at all we have to? For example, what if I have one studio where I'm primarily looking at profit making systems of production of buildings, and the other, uh, uh, for want of a better term, loss making or no profit no loss systems of production, in the sense that anything developer driven, where the building is a byproduct of a company, versus any act of building which is done primarily for use, and not to make money out of it. But of course, there could be many others. So to me, that is one of the issues of housing that I think schools are not able to get out of. And as a result of that, what happens is the moment we talk of housing instead of a house, in fact, many schools of architecture have a individual residence problem somewhere in the second year or thereabouts. And then in the senior years, you have this housing studio. And it leads to many problems. First, because the housing studio is in senior years, the assumption is that it has to be a large project because you're in your senior year of education and not in your junior year, which means that invariably it becomes a greenfield site, large scale large scale mass housing project, and we completely disregard the small incremental and transient type of
Mm.
housing, and we don't, somehow we are not clear where to position it within the 5 years of architectural education. Where do we look at this uh, uh, many projects maybe. So uh, I mean, digressing a bit here, I do think it's also this problem that in the fourth year, typically we want to do one large project instead of doing 10 small projects, all related to housing, because it's a senior year. So that I see as one direction. Uh, and co- and tying it to the idea of teaching, and I think what Prasad started off by saying the problem of the institution, and tying it to the idea of institution, um, I would like to posit that the whole, I mean, what again, what was being talked of, the idea of examination, the idea that you teach something and then you examine the student to check whether or not they have learned is in education it's called the behaviorism learning theory, where the assumption is that the student is an empty bottle, the teacher comes and pours knowledge into it, and then at the end of the semester opens the bottle and checks for the taste of education. I mean, that's and interestingly, I think that in the field of education and learning theory, people have moved from behaviorism to cognitivism, and then to social constructivism, and then to connectivism, which is what talks of the digital age and what is knowledge production in a digital era. I think that we have not redesigned our institutions and institutional structures to respond to a different way of learning. And that to me ties back to this question of housing. That's why ideally, or not ideally, that's why most schools end up giving a large project, and at the end of it you'll have a jury where students present uh, uh, a big set, huge set of drawings, plans, sections, elevations, views, uh, everything from 1,000 scale to maybe 50 scale for a project, and which means that the project has to be big. It cannot be small incremental housing. So I feel that these in very interestingly, this question is very much linked to the question of institution, because I think the current institutional structures, the fact that we have a semester long design studio, the fact that we have the final jury as a format, all this is biased against talking about small incremental and transient as equally important, or yeah, equally important design exercises. And so it's I think it's all jumbled up in one, and we need to completely dismantle this if we need to go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
thanks, Vishwanath. I think it kind of really also kind of kind of asks us to rethink how and why housing studios should be done the way they are. I think and like I was telling in the introduction, most architecture schools pose housing as this kind of mass production kind of question. Vastu, do you want to kind of maybe speak about, let's say, your experience from the repair and retrofit studio? And
Yeah. I actually resonate with what Vishwanath and Gautam kind of said, because it's only been 2 or 3 years since I've been out of school, and the idea of that mass-produced project, and you start with that, and that is how housing is taught in my experience of learning. But I'd also like to bring about our project that we're doing in C, the wetness project, where we're examining time is like the crucial element that we're examining, and then we are looking at household experiences, and how actually there is this incrementality in the way life kind of changes, the different way the family structure is changing, and then not really the built form, but the change in the family structure, the change in the modes of entrepreneurship, and the way it is actually incrementally actually shaping the built form, which includes not only the house, but not only that unit, but a lot of other things. I think that is really interesting, and the fact that these are like stories that we kind of collect. So the mode of analyzing it is very different. The way we look at housing is quite different. Then they're collected as fragments of a family's or of an individual's living experience, and I think. I think that opens up the landscape of housing in a very different way for a person like me, which is, and then you kind of understand these complexities that cannot really be dealt with this mass housing model or project. And I've been reflecting this on quite a lot of time with my colleague Rohit as well, where for example, in one studio we ask them to design the future, which is at a 2050 post tipping point, where your cities are going to be inundated. And so then how does one acknowledge this incrementality which is already there, which you're already studying on site, where the way life form is kind of shaping the inhabitation. So I mean, I'm just reflecting on it, but I think that that aspect of time, which actually Gautam brought out, was like really important, because, and also the fact that it's not only linear time, it's also cyclical time of the way households experience certain things, and then certain decisions are taken into place. So yeah, I mean, I'm still thinking about it. I'm trying to be articulate, but I think I'm going to take some time
Thanks, Vastu. Like, I mean, just to add to what Vastavik was saying, Vastavik and Rohit are part of a study that they're doing together with UPenn, and they're collecting stories of how people are dealing with, have been dealing with the floods situation in Bombay, in I think 8 different settlements or something like that, and they're collecting stories of 15 or 20, 50 households, something like that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in a sense, it ties back to what Gautam was saying, that how does one start building the grounds for thinking about incrementality as a kind of a larger framework for thinking about not only just housing, but also about cities, and how actually cities are produced in Indian context, broadly speaking, like the term Indian in that sense. But I'll just add 2 experiences from the housing studio that we do at C, just to kind of add to this conversation. One is so I think 2 years back we went to Trichy, and Trichy was very interesting because there was this police colony which was built some 20 kilometers on the outskirts towards east of the city, and in the 70s or 80s, I think. So a lot of retired police officials were occupying this kind of really neatly planned housing colony, but there was nothing around it except the housing colony. 2015 or something, the city decided to give a very small parcel of land as an SEZ. It's really tiny, 1 building parcel of land, which is declared as an SEZ. So it has 1 building with like 4 offices on each, one office on each floor, so 4-story building. And kind of so what that has happened. So this IT company is next to this police station, police colony, and you see that the people who kind of come to work in that IT whatever SEZ have eventually made home in that house in the police colony, right? And that has created an ecology for rental housing for those young people who have just graduated and working in these IT offices. And I showed one of the images of that in the presentation also, where let's say it's basically, I'll just go back to that slide maybe. The second image to the right is basically that's the house of how an IT worker is actually living inside a police colony, and making his basically young bachelors. No, they don't really need a fancy house and all of those kind of things. So it's a very interesting story because that colony is changing slowly and steadily, adding one floor at a time, and maybe sometimes it's just a tin sheet on top or a GI sheet on top. And houses are transforming in that way. So from 1970s and 80s to 2000 or 2020, if you take the timeline, it's a very slow change and a very kind of a different kind of demand that is emerging there. The second thing that came to my mind was that incrementality was not necessarily an alien concept even in big cities. Like after independence, the experience in Bombay, and if you move around Bombay, particularly the other Parsi colony, Bandra, and other areas, you see that these once the tiny bungalows are now have become big apartments, but not by redevelopment, but by adding additional columns on the outside. The kind of exoskeleton that kind of makes these convert these bungalows into apartment forms, and you add a lift to that building. So that takes about again a span of 20-30 years for a bungalow to transform into an apartment. And even in cities like Bombay, and like Gautam was mentioning, I think it is that kind of also opened a very interesting idea that incrementality is not necessarily the question of only low income, but it kind of spans across various classes also, number one, but also across various contexts and various scales of the city. So I think it is so in that sense. What we see is that the challenge then here is like, how do you kind of break, like Vishwanath was trying to say, that notion of time, or how does one kind of inculcate the notion of time in the practices of design? Because one of the things that happens in the process of incremental growth is that many intentions are at play. So design usually kind of propels only one intention, one idea, and then you in the case of small incremental kind of processes, you have various intentions playing even on a small thing, small object like a house. Like Gautam was saying, like if somebody has to decide whether to pay the tuition fee or to add that another wall or to add a roof to kind of take advantage of the rental demand or things like that. So I think it's an important and interesting challenge to kind of break away from the way we typically teach housing at schools. I think I'll move to the next question in that. So it's a connected question to the previous question, but here the question actually is, how can we teach so to speak mainstream architectural practice to students? Like in the sense, if you have to open an office tomorrow and then kind of hire employees and whatever, rent a space or buy a space, set up a studio, but keeping in mind that housing is still again not this kind of a big object that one has to kind of produce and deliver, but also by thinking about the multiplicities of housing process in that act of otherwise very formally bound architectural practice. Because that's another challenge, because a lot of this kind of housing that we see today is produced by so to speak mainstream architectural practice. So maybe Gautam again, so like just to go in that order.
Yeah, I can only answer this as an outsider, so I can cop out from the most difficult parts of this answer, which is about architecture as a profession, as not being an architect, not teaching in an architectural program. But I think it's useful to have that perspective, right? So for us, so the IHS class basically is deliberately curated to be multidisciplinary. So we literally have a rule that no more than 30% of our class can come from any one disciplinary cluster. Right? So you can't have more than so the 35 students say we have currently or last year, between them have 24 different undergraduate degrees. Right? So what it means is that for us, what's useful in that space is that what the verbs of practice are is not self-evident. So there is no immediate link between this profession does this. I mean, we have to work very hard to undo that training. An anthropologist does qualitative ethnography. An architect does spatial construction. An economist does this type of data analysis. A sociologist studies this, right? So one of the biggest difficulties that I think that our current education system does is that it links disciplines to professions, then to practices and to methods, right? So it kind of colonizes the sense of saying, why do you do ethnography? Because I'm an anthropologist. And that delinking of methods, practices with trainings and professions is a really important kind of unlearning for us. It was one of the bases for which IHS was set up, right? So when we speak of an urban practitioner as a kind of syncretic urban degree, our first question is, what is your urban practice? And it goes precisely to what Prasad was saying about separating profession from practice very concretely. Now, you can't do that naively, because your students have to get out and work in professions, right? So, but it is better to take that fight on clearly and transparently instead of defaulting to the profession and letting go of the practices. And we sort of see that happen all the time. So for me, this question would actually, in housing, the question for us is to say, if you forget your training and don't presuppose that the correct verbs for architects are design, construct, and build, what other verbs can architects hold, right? So why is it not, I'm an architect who's an organizer, I'm an architect who's a researcher, I'm an architect who's an archivist, I'm an architect who is part of a community building exercise, I'm an architect who's a citizen and a resident. Now, how to take those practices and give them a sustainable professional life is an important challenge for schools, because it would be irresponsible for us to suggest a range of practices that no human being without extraordinary economic and social privilege can actually afford to live, right? Because then they're full of practices, they graduate, and there is no place to actually get a salary and pay your rent and feed your family, you know what I mean? So I think, but that's the challenge we should be fighting. And I do believe that there are now more openings to have a much wider set of sustainable lives, which are centered on this broader set of practices. But I think the first thing we have to do is break this, ask again, what are our verbs? If housing is, for example, this incremental practice with multiple agents who produce it, if the architect is not the producer of housing, if that's not your core role, right, or it's designer of housing, how do then architects reimagine their verbs? This is a project in some of our work, in some of my own research, I've been thinking about the verbs for southern urban practice, right? I wrote a piece about this last year, and I was saying, what does it mean for us to think of repair and squat and consolidate as practices, not just the practices of agents? So if you want to create opportunities to work with upgrading and incremental housing improvement, how do you then mobilize your archives in working with the state in terms of its DCRs and norms and plans and housing programs to create those opportunities? I think the difficulty is that we're still at a time currently, because mass housing and redevelopment and state-produced redevelopment, complete housing units are the dominant political economy and imagination of our housing policy. So this is not an easy time to do it. We're not at a time where upgrading is in the air as a policy mechanism. So at this point, this is a point where we are all struggling to create those opportunities where folks with a certain sensibility, a certain skill set, and a certain training can wield those trainings and sensibilities into new forms of practices. And it is difficult because those opportunities have to be created just as students are getting out with this training and going in. And remember, architecture particularly is a professional degree for folks who put an enormous amount of investment and come into it. So I don't think this is going to happen overnight. So I think there are two tracks one has to take. One is to say, I think our responsibility in the classroom is we have to give students the archives of actually existing practices of housing. I think that to me is non-negotiable. So the early years of those studios, maybe Vishwanath, that's the thing. Those studios should be studios that generate the archives. Go tell us who made this housing that you see. Go tell us who lives there. Is the marital nuclear household actually the unit of housing arrangements? Go tell us. Go ask the question and come back, right? And the more people who ask that question from a number of sites, the more that archive builds. So what's key to us in our projects that our students go through is we ask them, go tell us again. We won't tell you, look, the family household is actually not the way 8 migrant workers who are security guards from the same village in Assam live in Bangalore, right? That when you say people who eat around a common kitchen as a census definition of household, don't assume marriage, heterosexuality, formation, generation, age, and composition. Don't make any assumptions around those. But importantly, now go to the field, look at housing, and tell us if we're right or wrong. So I think as long as you are creating urban practitioners who are constantly producing archives of the living arrangements, we're asking not what is housing, we're saying, tell us how people are living spatially. Tell us how they come together. What are these units of collectivity? And I think what's exciting about this time is there are lots of conceptual offerings in other disciplines to draw upon, right? So writing, for example, about forms of everyday collective life. Writings in queer urbanism about how the household has never been the stable form, right?
Right.
Writings in development studies out of South Africa that are saying, you know what, I'll give you one example out of Sao Paulo. There is this category called solo mother, my solo, right? And the solo mother is a category of women who live with their children, but do not live with the fathers of their children. Not because, as a previous category used to be, they were abandoned or left or separated or divorced, because they choose not to live with the father of their parents. But many of them now children in a collective living arrangement, right, which is now the dominant living arrangement in the peripheries of Sao Paulo, to the extent that the housing census tells you that half the households are households without an adult male quote unquote father in that space. What do you do with that space? What do you do with the fact that it happens in the periphery? What are its sociological, political implications? What are its infrastructural implications? What are its notions for a basic income scheme or a child support family grant, right, that goes via the household? So, I think that the production of these different archives is something that we've got to give folks. And then we have to give them a broader set of verbs that can describe their practices. I organize, I engage, I archive, I research, I write. I'm thinking in some sense when the National Law School was first set up, like all desis, anytime an institution is good, you go to it. Now, whether you want to study law or engineering, it doesn't matter. The institution is good. So hundreds of people went to NLS in Bangalore. And those first years of graduates from NLS were poets, organizers, politicians. I mean, very few of them thought of law as a practicing profession. It's no longer true of NLS today. But at that point, if you think of those sets, they were informed by the sensibility of a training in law. They had a skill set, a sensibility, methods, and a conceptual language. Architecture has that. And the question is to unhook it from just the firm and the practice slowly. I don't want to sort of make this about a distinction between architects who then become interdisciplinary urban practitioners and those who work in an architectural firm. That's not the division I want to make. Because the folks who go to the firm are going to have to find other ways of acupuncturing the archives into projects that have professional constraints, real world clients. That is an art unto itself. And that's the last point I want to make about this round, that we have to equip also our students to do acupunctural incremental insertions of their sensibilities into firms and projects and clients that don't welcome them. The thing about interdisciplinary thought or new kinds of teaching around pedagogy is that the professional practice is not going to say, that's amazing, let me rethink the structure of my firm and not be a boss anymore. We have to prepare our students that it is not going to be welcome. That kind of change is not welcome. It's going to make, and so you have to prepare them with the skills of how to insert their sensibilities. Realize that insertion will happen slowly sometimes. Some of them will get dream projects with new firms, and that's amazing. But most of them are going to have to wait and bide their time. And one of the things I tell my students a lot is, your first project may not allow you the most radical imagination of incremental housing. Your second will let you do a little more. Your third will let you do a little more. And it may take your fourth until you can actually control some of it enough. So it is, if housing is incrementally built, why would our own practice not be incremental? Why would our own ability to explain? So I think sometimes what happens is that you see all of these new ideas where we unpack the pedagogy in the classroom and then send them back unprepared into a totally unreconstructed professional space. And that's like, one of our alumni came back one day and said, thoda to prepare kar diya hota. Thoda to keh diya hota ki it will feel like a slap in the face. And since then, we are much less romantic about our unpacking. But I think that there are lots of really interesting moves to be made here, right? And to me, the core things are about produce the archives so that everyone is immersed in them, no matter what professional choices they make. Think about a different set of verbs, so people never take the firm client design route. And for those who do take the more currently traditional architectural route, imagine incremental ways of shifting and adding these layers project to project, and not expect not expect a full transformation immediately, but know that it is possible. Know that it's absolutely possible to redo an affordable housing project with a perfectly good developer. You may not be able to do all 9 things you want to do, but if you can do 2 or 3 or 4, that's how you start shifting the needle in those ways. So that's the way I would say.
Thanks, Gautam. Vishwanath, would you like to go
Yeah.
next? Just to kind
No,
of
this.
break,
Yeah,
uh,
sure.
I think just to bridge, I think Vishwanath is also interested in this disjunct between teaching and practice in many ways. And I attended a lecture by Vishwanath many years ago, not many, but like few years ago, at CEPT, where he was talking interestingly about giving new meaning to the spaces that are assigned in a house. That was also quite interesting. Just as an anecdote, I was reminded.
Right. Right. Yes, that's yeah. But yeah, this is also very interesting because since the last couple of years, so I alternatively one design studio that I take offer is on housing or questioning housing. That's the Oikopolis studio. The alternate studio I offered is titled The Practice, where I'm asking questions about the relationship of education to practice, and of course then putting the spotlight on both. And so in fact, as part of that, over the last 2 years, we are every semester we interview about 20 odd architectural practices in India, in order to understand where is practice heading and where is education heading. So what I feel is that the I mean, yeah, to begin with, when normally people talk of architectural practices, they are actually talking of firms or offices, which I think is the first problem, that the word practice is used as a noun and not a verb. But touching upon the noun part of it a little bit, I do think that the classical way in which architectural offices or firms are organized, I think they are not lean or nimble enough to be able to address multiplicity of housing processes. Uh, uh, to give a simple example, in a mainstream office, if I have to do any project whose fees says only 2000 rupees, I can't think of any office which can take that project. You know what they would prefer to do? They would prefer to call it pro bono and offset it with projects which are making money. Yeah. So what we have done is, just like we are talking of multiplicity of housing processes, we need to talk of multiplicity of architectural practices. Just like even in doctors, there might be one general physician, say, charging 50 rupees per consultation, and there might be some specialist charging 5000 rupees a consultation. The key thing is, even that 50 rupees, doctor is able to run their office and to make a livelihood out of it. And I think that's also again very important what Gautam mentioned, that it's not about service to society. A lot of mainstream architectural practices also, who have their heart in the right place to do these kind of projects, but they primarily look at it as pro bono projects which they will offset with other projects, but not as a mode of working. And I think that means that if today a cooperative housing society wants to get minor changes done, or maybe the housing is in a slightly dilapidated condition and they want to work to figure out the best way of going about it, or if someone wants to add one more room to their house, they don't approach architects. And so in that sense, the mainstream mode of architectural practice, I would say, is very elitist. And there is no harm. Of course, we need architects to make greenfield project large buildings also, because that is also needed in society. But architectural education is not even talking about, neither is mainstream practice talking about what are the alternative ways of designing a practice, which I think is a question that again I would tie back to what was said in the introduction. It's the institution which can start discussing this or debating this, of course in collaboration with practitioners. uh, till that happens, I think we will be stuck in this idea of a office which has 30% as overheads and 30% going in salaries, and therefore not even looking at these kind of projects as projects. So that is, I think, one part of the problem. I would very quickly also like to tie it back to architectural education by saying that uh, what I briefly mentioned earlier, that uh, in most cases design studios begin with a greenfield site, and except for sometimes, in very junior years, first year, second year, where you might get a small project to add a room to a house or something like that, but that is just focusing on anthropometrics and maybe construction, not larger questions of society or economics. And this therefore this becomes a problem when you have to talk about multiplicity of housing processes and uh, uh, architectural practice or mainstream architectural practice looking at multiplicity of housing processes. And therefore I think we, even in the academic space, one needs to discuss what are the other forms, sustainable forms of practices that are absolutely lean and nimble and can uh, 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 deal with projects of this scale. Uh, I think the question, on the other hand, yes, when we talk about collaboration or architects collaborating with other uh, 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 people from other disciplines, uh, yes, mainstream architectural practice doesn't do that very often. And I think increasingly now people are talking about it. But I think for this specific question, it is more important to talk about what is a sustainable project for an architectural practice. And to I ask this question always in a very simple manner: can I do a project where my fees is 200 rupees or 2000 rupees? Is it possible? What will I have to do if I want to make a living out of 2000 rupee fee projects? And to me, that's a very interesting question, and I don't have any answers. It's just uh, thinking loud, thinking out aloud. Yeah.
Isha, I just want to
Yeah.
maybe ask you one more question, and I think
Yes.
it's
Yes.
tied to what Gautam was mentioning as to how does one start kind of building new maybe archives of verbs or terms.
Right. Right.
Uh,
Yes.
and connected to that is the studio that you conduct at the housing studio, particularly at SET.
Yes. Yeah.
There are three main kind of I think every year there was one theme, right?
Yeah.
Home, um,
Yeah.
uh, the question of clone, or rather mass
Yes.
production, the reputation of
Yeah.
housing, uh, and I think I forgot the third one, what it was. But anyways, I think in
Yeah.
every year, what is interesting is that there were also students who were gathering stories from various parts of the
Yeah.
city, right?
Mm.
And there, I remember seeing this, a section on memory, a section on
Yes.
home,
Yes.
and I think that that's also an interesting way in which it kind of intersects with, or rather, even maybe
Right.
dismantles in many ways the notion of how architects trained to kind of become this quote unquote
Yes.
profession would
Yes.
join offices, would also be kind of in a way equipped with alternative imagination, right? In
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
thinking.
Mm.
What do you think? Like, how do you think that sort of thinking kind
Right.
of intersperses with this kind of
Yeah.
mainstream thinking of housing in
Right.
practice?
Yeah. Yeah. That's also interesting. Yes. So the first one was called At Home in the City, and the second, which was talking of the relationship between the home and the city, and therefore what is the idea of the questions of scale from the room all the way up to the city. The second one, which was the Attack of the Clones, of course, playing on uh, s-
Right.
yeah. Uh, it asked questions of mass housing and also the idea of cloning repetition. And the third one was the rise of the cooperative, where we were asking questions of is developer driven housing the only mode of producing housing in the city. And interestingly, I mean, of course, it has its own problems, but interestingly, now with FSI changes in many parts of the city, a lot of housing societies are voluntarily, uh, partially voluntarily going for redevelopment, and therefore it there's a very different model at play. But yes, so since you mentioned the other exercises in the studio, yes, I think I mean, the moment you mention mass housing, the immediate next step is either say LIG, MIG, HIG, or you say 2 BHK, 3 BHK, 4 BHK. So I think a substantial part of the studio, in all the three versions, questions this. And there I begin with a simple question. I ask all students in my class to tell me what a bedroom is called in their mother tongue. And it's very interesting because Hindi, Gujarati, Marathi, Tamil, none of the languages have any word for bedroom. For that matter, they have no word for living room either. They do have words for kitchen, they have words for toilet. um, they have words for veranda or a barsati, so interestingly, if at all there are words, they are words which are tied to the spatial characteristics. So there'll be a chalk or a courtyard, there'll be a osri or a vasri, or there'll be uh, and then there'll be barsati, or there'll be kholi. And and then it goes up to the level of building elements also, like a jharoka, for example, or a baithak. And I think that there if we want to really sort of shake up this very strong idea of housing, the uh, uh, a well entrenched idea of housing as 2 BHK and 3 BHK, I think we have to attack it at the smallest scale. And I feel that hopefully that will crack open this idea of the house. It also cracks open the idea of the family, because
Right.
I always find it weird that you're talking of 2 BHK, 3 BHK, 4 BHK, and then you tie it up with, of course, the cost of the house, and it gets tied up to questions of affordability or what you can afford to. And therefore, a 1 BHK is always associated with a low income group. Why can't someone who is very well off but doesn't want to marry and wants to have a very good 1 BHK, or rather a very luxurious 1 BHK, whereas someone who cannot afford and has a large family of four will also unfortunately have to make do with a smaller house. So I think attacking what is a home is extremely important to bring back the focus on multiplicity of housing in the city.
Right.
Yeah, so
Vasika, do you want to come in on this? Like,
Just a very small comment. I really admire that part where you said, how do you design a practice? And I think, like, reflecting on it, I think, like, yesterday's day where, we were talking through one of our students' practice where, they are talking about the cooperative, but they're trying to engage with the quality of life that the cooperative kind of affords, the older form kind of affords. And what they're actually doing is they're enabling content, they're making content, and they're kind of advocating that kind of form. And I see that as legitimate a practice as as a form. And I think there is where that negotiate that they are. I think that they'll be able to negotiate that. Like what they're kind of learning in this thing, but also like getting into the
right.
into the mainstream design kind of this thing. So I think if you can like broaden that definition also and start looking at how do you start designing your practice, which they've actually kind of they begin from college itself, like they start thinking about it maybe through the later years. I think that becomes then that designing is also very incremental in the way they go about uh, engaging with the housing processes. So yeah, I mean, it was just a small comment that I was thinking about.
Yeah, I think in all the three comments, I think one thing what is interesting is to shift from looking at architectural practice as a kind of a, like what Vishwanath said, as a noun, but to kind of look at literally, practice, like you're actually doing something with your time, with your space, with your, energy and resource. Where are you going to actually invest it? And, how are you engaging? Particularly housing, I've always thought that, but when it comes to architects, housing sort of is like this kryptonite for Superman. Like it leaves you bruised. You don't want to be anywhere near that. That situation. You're kind of happy with doing other things. There's nothing wrong in that, but I think generally that's the kind of outlook that has developed, particularly around housing. And just to tie it back, I think, like Gautam mentioned, the case of the law college in Bangalore. If you look at architects, even like 100 years ago, all the classical ones, whether it is Corbusier, Hans Meyer, Patrick Geddes, you name them. Till 1980s, you have architects who did not hesitate, kind of, even not even considering themselves architects, but simply who are interested in the world, in the city, in how people are actually doing things, what needs to be done, just throwing out ideas left, right, and center, right? I mean, Corbusier is not even trained as an architect, neither Geddes, nor was, many architects who did not formally trained at all, but really were developing their, like what Gautam was saying, their own practice of engaging with the city in some sense. So I think maybe one thing in that way, probably to do, is to kind of maybe encourage students to somehow try to locate and build that question of practice for themselves by identifying some of the other developments that are taking place in the city, how are the cities changing, and where they can locate themselves, and to kind of move away from this strangely ideological question that gets posed to them, I think in a very bad light also. What is the role of the architect in the society? Like, I mean, if you want to be part of the society, then you should know and probably, be aware of what are the practices, what is your practice towards that society, quote unquote, and not kind of make it a grand gesture about the role of the architect in that.
Sure, I just wanted to say something just on what you said, is that
Yeah.
I think the responsibility, because this is a discussion specifically on pedagogy, I think the responsibility is that in order for, and I totally agree with you, right, that all of us, no matter what we do, architecture to law to poetry to engineering, have to find ways to hold the width of our practices against the structures of our professions. All of us do. None of us get that one-to-one fit, right? So I think the thing is to, but in order to get a set of practices for yourself, right? So we ask our students when they go, what is your practice? Now, it doesn't mean you're going to get to practice it tomorrow, right? But what is it? What is it you're trying to build? But in order to do that, somewhere in their education, they must have an opportunity to experiment with different forms of practices and engagement, with different forms of methods, right? So if we don't give them that training, that we don't give them the opportunity to engage with the urban in different ways, to ask the question, to build the archives, to teach them the methods, to say, look, all of these methods are equally open to you as architects. Your toolbox is not limited to these 4 ways of being an architect. I think all our disciplines and training struggle with this. It's equally true for sociologists as it is for architects. Nothing unique to it is the way disciplines are structured. And there is a value in that. But I think pedagogy has to give them the opportunity to find their practice, to ask them the question of, say, what is your practice? And then allow them some glimpse of methods to say, if you want to lean in on this practice, or take Vishwanath's provocation and say, let's try and build a practice around this, to have some place in their training where they've tasted it. They know what it looks like to do it. They know, they have some confidence in their ability to do it. I think because also we default sometimes on the practices of the profession because we don't have the confidence to build an alternative practice. Not just we don't know how to design it institutionally, which is a key question that Vishwanath has asked, is we also intellectually can't imagine those practices and their everyday work and their methods. So it means that the methods, training, and the structure of the years of pedagogy have to allow and build that confidence. Otherwise, we're sort of asking more existential questions to students and giving them even less tools to answer them. So that balance, I think, is a bit key.
Absolutely. I think I was not expecting these 2 questions will take so long. We have, I think, 30 minutes more. So I'll just kind of quickly move to the next question. It's okay. This is again ties back to, let's say, the previous 2 questions, but here again, the question is basically in also linking to the question of if we assume that housing is kind of located within the changes that are taking place in urbanization of various kinds across cities, then how is it then possible to again engage with the pedagogy of housing with that framework in mind? I mean, we saw so far that there's a question of incrementality, there's a question of new terms, but like how does one really engage with, let's say, make sense of the changes that are taking place in the cities and locate the housing questions and hence maybe practices within that? I'll tie the second question in this.
So I think, so I'll just very briefly, because I know we're tight on time. So I'll just say two very simple things on this. One is, I think here is a real case for the need for diverse classrooms. Because if you have a classroom where people come from different scale settlements and forms of urbanization, this is not a fight. Because when you say, what is housing where you live, they say, da, 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 da. We have seen this in our classrooms, right? When you have, so this is one of those real cases where, you create a metropolitan classroom with folks with very different life worlds and biographical life experiences. You have to correct this intellectually. If your classroom doesn't have that skew, then you don't have to correct it intellectually. I think that's a really important point that, I mean, we have learned extraordinarily and been able to teach only because of a classroom whose life experiences are diverse enough. So you don't have to bring up the question of the small town or the new corridor or the transitioning urban census town, because students from there are in your classroom and say, this is what it's like, and I think that's a really pivotal point about not just doing this intellectually. And I think that the second part about this goes back to that question of saying that, even whether it's architecture or another program, we have to begin from a current structural understanding of urbanization, where we have to say, these new cities on the expressway are being born as enclaves. What does it tell us about theories of organic growth of cities? What is it about the census towns moving, classifying, declassifying? What does this sort of stretch of urban development look like on this corridor? So I think it means beginning with a sort of diagnostic take on the political economy of urbanization and its real empirics at a larger scale within which we embed ourselves. So I think, again, it means that there is a certain distance, a certain weight before you get into housing design, building project. You have to begin with a more broader foundation for understanding the urban, no matter which urban sector we work in. This is true of water, engineering, climate change, adaptation, human development, poverty, slum. It is about that broader understanding of the urban question. And I think any of us who teach in anything called urban should ask the question before we go in. So those are the two things that I would say.
Thanks. Vishwanath, your response?
Okay. I'm responding as if this question is asked of an architectural institution. Or say if C is asking this for itself, because I completely agree with what Gautam says, that ideally you would have a multidisciplinary class and you wouldn't have a classroom which is full of architects. Uh, but in an architecture school, I do think that two things that I would like to say is shifting from architectural thinking to design thinking. Because I think the moment we think of it as an architectural studio, we think that the logical outcome is a building. But if if I'm providing a creative solution to a problem faced by someone who wants a new house, or someone who wants to do something with their house, or an entire society wants to do something with their houses, if I'm going to just suggest putting in rainwater harvesting systems and repainting it, or making letting go of the security guard, or maybe making a small toilet on the ground floor, uh, it is actually a very well thought, calibrated, sensitive response. So as a designer, you have done your job, but I can't imagine an architectural jury where the student just comes, pins up a sheet of paper and said, I'm proposing repainting the whole building. That's my proposal. There would be a lot of arguments for it. And so to me, that is one, that let us think of ourselves as creative thinkers and not necessarily architectural thinking. The second, I would say, in a studio environment is de-emphasizing form. And of course, this requires multiple changes, that if we don't have to think of architecture as building and building as form, uh, I then also question why have plan sections. So interestingly, few years back, I did a studio where in the entire studio and in the final jury, there were no plan sections. Okay, you could either use words or you could do walkthroughs or have a series of perspectives. Interestingly, all the jurors who were called for the jury were also struggling to comment on the students' designs because the plans and sections were not there. But plan and section is just an abstract thing. No? So there were no physical models either. So no plans, no sections, no perspective views from outside, and no models. So you have no idea of what the building looks like, but yet the descriptions and the walkthroughs have to be very detailed. So you have to talk of the railing, you have to talk of the door. But if I have to talk of the railing without drawing it, uh, then the question entirely changes. I start asking different questions of the railing. Maybe I start asking questions of how does it age, what happens when it starts moving, or can I rest myself against it, instead of asking what ms rod is it, or is it wooden, or is it opaque or transparent. So I would say doing these two things might sort of shake it up in a design studio environment.
Right. Vasev, with a very quick comment. No? All right. Okay. I just a couple of things that come to my mind with as a kind of very short response to this is also that I think often the idea of form is also seen as a very kind of a limited idea with which has a very how do I say, a very kind of a certain finality in terms of, particularly with respect to housing when one thinks about it. But I think if we actually kind of bring in the thinking of time, bring in the energy of how people actually build their houses and what are the various ways in which housing are getting actually produced, I think we can change the way we look at the idea of form in a different way. Uh, I mean, for instance, it was not an uncommon practice, for even someone like B.V. Doshi to draw a kind of a series of frames with how a house would grow over time. The initial set would just be one room and a toilet, and the typical site and services schemes, and then just to offer an imagination of what life would be in, let's say, 10 years down the line. And I think I think that imagination of form, where we don't consider form as a kind of fixed entity, but the various possibilities that may act upon and kind of make it emerge over a period of time and consolidate for a short while and then kind of become something else again 5 years later, would be something also an interesting way to think about the questions of form of housing in that sense also. I think we are very, very short of time in that sense. Actually, not really, but unless there are comments and questions from the audience, I can quickly take them now. Thanks everyone, so far to kind of for very, very wonderful responses. Let's see, there are four. No, it's not here. Okay, question and answer. So we have four questions or comments. Let's start with Apurva. Apurva, do you want to come in and maybe make the comment?
She is not in the attendees.
All right. So Apurva Sharma is saying, I feel like there are waves of production. There are phases of small, incremental, gradual changes, and then maybe a series of faster, bigger, more disruptive change. Oh, she's here. She's here.
Yeah, she's okay. Just got it.
Apurva, do you want to unmute? Sorry, you're on mute.
Hello.
Yes, Apurva. Yeah.
No, I was. Hi, everyone. I was thinking about when we were talking about time and like right in the beginning about incrementality and looking at even real estate projects or developer projects. Or so right now, like I'm working on my own house, which is also a construction project that has been going on. And time, even in that incrementality or whatever, the time plays a huge role even in fast projects as to how decisions are made and why they're called delays or why they're called the stalling of a project and things like that, and the way like a synergy needs to happen for to be able to do something or to be able to build something of process, like the synergy of processes that needs to come in come together at one time for something to actually happen. And so I was trying to sort of articulate what incrementality looks like in that scenario, or how do we, like, how do we talk about that, or how do we kind of think about that?
True. Also, just one short remark for that. Again, I think up until 90s at least, there was a very interesting common sense across cities, something called as waiting bars, in construction site. Even in Chandigarh, I was recently in Chandigarh and I showed these photographs to Apurva also. Like when you're kind of coming from the airport and entering the city, there's a series of commercial developments that are going on, these kind of small lots. And there you have to leave horizontal waiting bars. So for the building to expand horizontally. And, up until 90s, people used to build like maybe 2 floors and leave these columns super and call them waiting bars to be added much later, eventually also. So I think time does play out a very important role in that sense also. Prasad, you have a comment. We have plenty of time, so you can please come in and comment.
Sir, I have a series of things to say very quickly. I think one point that did not come out is that the logic of building construction in the building industry, where you create a design first and then tender it and then do the specification, bill of quantities, tender and find the contractor, and then kind of that logic of building construction differs from the logic of how housing happens, and that is where and what we end up teaching students is that logic of building construction in the market, but not in outside the market or so. That is number one. So then how does one deal with it? Look at the mechanics in which the other logic works. And that's where Gautam comes in and says that, the archive creates an extremely good possibility to kind of, understand those mechanics. I would extend that idea of the archive into the idea of the archive of a locality, because give it a locality boundary to it. Because in our repair and retrofit studio, what we found was that where it is shared and built constantly by people who are connected to a specific locality, then it is useful for them to negotiate. They know the local politics. It's not a general thing, but it's a local archive. So archive has a neighborhood boundary, so that kind of a strategy is an interesting strategy to think about for us. Secondly, also look at repair and retrofit very closely, because the questions of incrementality, the multiplicity, repair of habitation, add a painting, add paints, put up a water harvesting line, etc., etc., etc. I think these are all within the gamut of repair and retrofit, and I think it's a very important course that we should kind of develop further and kind of look at it very carefully. The third thing, I think the question of form and the question of aesthetic is something which we need to invest very closely. Not only because what you said, Shreyank, about the question of form, but the question of form, it's connected to social space very closely. The form shapes behavior and experience. And I think that the way form kind of shapes behavior and experience, meaning, I think that is something which needs to be kind of, it requires investment from the academia, and I think that question of form is very, very important. And there the verbs of Gautam or the tools of Vishwanath, I think those are very important kind of thing. And finally, what Gautam said, the idea of the landscape approach, even with the even with Vishwanath, don't look at a house, but look at the landscape, landscape of the neighborhood, the landscape of the building, the whole. So 4 points: locality-based archive, the repair and retrofit, uh, uh, the form question, and the landscape. The landscape. I think these are the 4 coordinates for me, which I take from this conversation actually.
And if I can just add to what Prasad just said, I think this is, you take this idea of form, it doesn't strike me so much because I realize that we don't experience this concept as so specific and predefined when we're not in architectural classrooms. Right? I find form very playful as a nice kind of, but I've been in the architectural classroom and I realize the kind of weight it holds. But even there, incrementally, for example, I always find it surprising when I see architects come into my classrooms on how, when they think of form, they think of it as this deeply material thing, this deeply spatial thing. But if you think of form as the outcome of law, they don't have an articulation of it. If you think of form as an outcome of cultural movement, of social relations, of, form can be a fabric. So I think form is a wonderful interdisciplinary concept, as long as you read it literally as equally produced socially, morally, culturally, through everyday practice, through legal regimes of tenure, through attempts of the political economy of capital and land markets. So I think that there's a way in which, even if one wants to hold on to form as something that sort of holds something that is a spatial science, there is a way that the ways you arrive at form must insist on a plurality of registers, right? That you must take as seriously the landscape. So this question of saying how do different legal regimes produce different material forms is a very important way to understand the distinction between an urban village, a resettlement colony, a JJ cluster, and a peri-urban housing development. And I think that so whether one anchors the plurality of approaches on a concept like form, or whether one steps away from form and looks at the urban, there are many ways to organize it pedagogically. But the insistence is on that plurality. And what it then does is to say, even if you want, as an architect or a spatial practitioner, to produce a built environment, right? You want to make something. There are many ways to influence the production of the built environment, of which construction and design and building are only one. If folks like me who don't construct and design absolutely believe that our practices produce built environments. So I think the thing to think about that is, even if one wants to relate with the material environment as an outcome, there are pluralities of ways to do it. And it's that opening up, that plurality, that is useful. And I think the one thing that is interesting is the plurality of methods and approaches, or to take what Rupali had put in the chat, a plurality of conceptual locations. So if you just insist, right, if you take time and say, work with me to separate home, house, household, and housing, just 4 words. You can, it is like a multi-scalar in-depth. So this question of what makes a home, what makes a home a household, what makes a household, how does it fit into something you call a house? Just the play in that will insist. So I think there are particular entry points that insist on a kind of unpacking and multiplying and layering. And I think that the more we can grab those entry points, pedagogical possibilities will unfold in front of us, and I think, so, and then Prasad and I can even debate, right? So I've always had this sense of housing, not houses, for us was always the move from the unit to the neighborhood. But honestly, post last year, I'm again challenging my own notions of the neighborhood and the locality as a sufficient scale, right? Particularly because of the kind of mobility, intra and intercity, that we saw, that Prasad talked about. So I think it's again go back and say, okay, given the flows of people that we have seen in this last year, what does form have to say to this notion of flow? So what does housing have to say to this mobility, to what Renu Desai described as always multi-local lives, not migrant lives, not movement, not distress push-pull, but always multi-local lives, right? What is the, if the urban is multi-local, then the question of, housing form in one city is completely relational to those other living arrangements in all the other locations. So I think that, but the point is to ask that question of home, of housing, of scale, of all of those things at one point. But there are particular and better suited pedagogical entry points that do that work for you easier than others. So I think what's important is for us to say, which is it? Form is, to me, doable. But if we go into materiality, it's harder. So I think that's the thing to also think about. What entry points allow an opening up, a plurality of practices more than others pedagogically?
Vishwanath, you want to?
Yeah. I also think that, see, as architects, we cannot deny or escape from form. I think, and in that sense, to talk about form is very important. The distinction or the question I always ask myself and the students is form a design tool or a design outcome? Are you producing form or are you using form as a means to achieve something? And therefore, in the final jury, do you present a set of drawings which show one form, which automatically means that your form, there is a final form to your building? But if I say that two different forms, three dimen three-dimensional compositions can produce the same end result in terms of experience or in terms of use or in terms of they are interchangeable. It doesn't matter for me as an architect whether you build this or you build this, because they produce the same experience, they produce the same outcome. So to me, the question that we need to ask in design schools is where are you talking about form? And I think that is important.
Yeah. So I'll ask Rupali to come in at this point, and then I'll ask Rohit, because Rohit has been, developing the idea of affordance for our studio where we teach, particularly, and we try to use that idea of affordance when we are discussing with students in the studio. So first, I'll ask Rupali, and then maybe Rohit can follow up, and then we have just 10 minutes, and we can wrap from there.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, Rupali.
Yeah. So I think just two sort of coordinates. One is this idea. I mean, I just kind of typed that in, the idea of the home sort of being extended beyond the boundary of the beyond the property boundary of the unit, but starting to look at the idea of neighborhood and the city, and in that sense, then really sort of thinking of how to invest in that, and I think in the pandemic there's some really interesting, and when saying building the archive, I think some of the students, the thesis students, found some really interesting ways in which, she was one of the students, Priyanshi, I'm sure she's here. She was looking at the idea of co-working, okay? And there's a split in Mumbai. You have this huge, there are co-working spaces in this place called Mindspace, which is like a huge corporate sort of hub. And just on the other side is a self-built settlement, Prem Nagar, which is really large. And there again, you'll see that people have started organizing themselves to create co-working, studying spaces, And so in that sense, there are already, building practices of looking at the archive are showing us that there are other possibilities, of kind of collective living that is there. And we've seen it historically, but you're seeing very interesting contemporary examples as well, right? So in that sense, how do you kind of shift that focus from the unit to thinking of the neighborhood? That is one. The second is actually, if you look at the census, and this is where the whole sort of discussion of housing shortage comes in, that you see that one of the statistics shows that 57% of people live in one room tenements, and one room, tenements went one room dwellings. But like, for example, the way that is the definition itself, takes away all other, like the veranda, for example, is removed from that, right? So if you have a veranda, that's not counted, right? So in that sense, again, I think the question of form comes in, and we've seen again in the archives that there are so many ways in which people share, like for example, some of the chawls in Mumbai, you have beautiful spaces where, the house is a porous entity where you can actually sort of, walk from one end to the other end. You have neighbors coming in and all of that. And in the absence of social security, that porous house is an interesting form to have, because that's what kind of allows that form of security to happen, because your neighbors then, stand in for you. And but then there are other places. There is the extended veranda, there are bridges that connect houses, and that space becomes an extended living room, and that's where I think the form again comes in, and form becomes then also tied to experience, right? So I think those questions are important to bring back into pedagogy, because I think we miss in this idea, the statistical idea of housing, we miss much of this, so I think that's something that I wanted to kind of bring in. How do you kind of look at, beyond statistics, the idea of form and experience as a way of thinking of housing?
Right. Thanks, Rupali. I think one of the things that I see interestingly is that the idea of practice of various kinds is getting reinforced again and again in this kind of discussion. I think Rohit, do you want to come in and maybe respond to the
Yeah, I didn't want to come from the angle of a fault.
No, I just asked. Okay, anyways, go ahead. Are you here, Rohit? No.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can hear you.
Yeah, I didn't want to come from the angle of affordances, but I wanted to kind of, uh, I mean, kind of add to what Gautam spoke about, and he kind of drew in the idea of verb, the housing as a verb, and incrementality as a verb into the archive. And um, in terms of the crossover that seems to be happening, in terms that you can't have practices anymore in silos, but you need to move across disciplines and think of practices in multiple ways. I'm just wondering if the archive, along with the verb, requires the metaphor and the analogy, because then you don't distinguish between the process, like incrementality as a process and incrementality as a form to it, and that those crossovers then become important. So for somebody who's kind of engaging with process oriented things, also needs to understand the metaphor and the analogy, which are useful ways of thinking about form, and the other way around. So kind of those crossovers need to be opened out. I mean, what Shreyans was trying to point out was that what we are trying to do in some of our housing work explorations is to ask the question of, through the metaphor and the analogy, whom is this housing for, not in terms of build that archive in terms of a metaphor or an analogy. What is the site as, or site not in terms of the site where you will build, the site of what one considers home, which is what Rupali and Prasad are kind of uh, opening out. Then the question of what is the home as, how does one imagine the home? And therefore the question of even time, what is the housing as? So all of these then become worked out through metaphors and analogies. And I kind of pointing out that across different kinds of disciplines, that the process oriented and the metaphor or analogy oriented um, archive needs to be built together. So that was one thing. The other thing I wanted to ask as a question, I think, to Gautam was, I really liked your proposition on thinking about incrementality as the larger logic of urbanization. Now, in all earlier works around incrementality, which have posed it as a step-by-step process of muddling within the government or the way of living of the urban poor, and then one comes to they have kind of thought of it in linear ways of linear sequencing, and that's what Barris's work problematizes, right? Which also Prasad mentioned about. And then you have Abdul Malik Simon's work, who puts forth the idea of incrementality working in non-linear ways. like building on, I mean, I just want to ask you, what are the analytical coordinates that you might want to think or develop in terms of thinking about time in incrementality?
I mean, Rohit, that is like Dhasu question, but I will attempt, I will attempt a little bit on just the way I think a little bit about time. I think that it is, so I think the move from linearity, certainly I think is one is able to do, right? And I think what someone like Abdul Malik Simon is very good at is to insist on not trying to forefront a certain productivity to everyday life, right? That it's certain that this notion that it has to add up in some ways to something. And I think that there is a lot, for example, I think there's a lot in our archives around time where outside the current of nostalgia, we are not able to actually think of the way things fall apart. I think that the way things decay, I think the way things are actually destroyed, other than, even destruction for us is renewal. Right? Because it's almost impossible to just say, look, this town used to exist and its factory died in its industry. I think there's a reason why it is very hard to have urban theory from Detroit, for example, than it is out of anywhere else. Because that the fear of that conclusion, that some kind of futurity is not possible, that this ephemeral everyday is a medium-term stable condition, that there is not that. I think we all struggle with that idea of time. But I think that for me, some of the very useful anchor points have been to actually both take seriously the long-term futurity of what we call the everyday, and take less seriously the grand futurity of what present themselves as 20-year projects. And I think it's provincializing that first claim and amplifying that second claim that allows us a new play around time, right? That you actually take seriously what it means to sustain as a practice of time and futurity, not grow, but sustain, to hold on to remain. I think it's interesting that so much of the new sort of urban politics, citizenship stuff talks about the right to stay put, the right to remain, the right to hold on, as opposed to the right to thrive and grow and flourish, etc. Right? So I think there's an interesting logic there. I also think that there is a unexplored conceptual overground between thinking in the Anthropocene about time and futurity and thinking about the urban, right? Because I think fundamentally the question of time is being unsettled across disciplines, particularly when, limitless resource expansion, fossil fuel-based industrial modernity are no longer viable long-term organizers of time. So I think it's a really important, it's an interesting opportunity to borrow also from those questions around time, and which are challenging also a lot of notions that have time embedded in them, like value and growth, and all of those things that we have to think about when we think about the urban. So I think that there are multiple ways to do it, but in a very principled way for me, finding ways to provincialize those practices that claim long-term time, like say the Delhi Master Plan, which is now coming out for the next 20 years, but also sort of really take seriously the long-term futurity claims of everyday sustenance, which have claims embedded in them. And it's the settlement that has been here for 25 years, right? And to claim that as a kind of claim on time and futurity, I think that's the way I'm thinking about some of those. But it's there's so many ways to think about those kinds of questions in housing particularly, or in other ways. And I wanted to say one very quick thing on what you said about the archive, right? I think that there are two, I think, the production of the archive as a pedagogical method, I think allows you both those choices, which is not to sort of, make those, and I think you have to wield them very differently, as pedagogically to different ends. So I am very I favor the archive, the production of the archive that talks about the processes of production of housing, which is what I opened with as my pedagogical bet. Because I think that when we focus on the archives of the processes of producing housing, it allows all of us to find practices and find ourselves in those practices. It already begins asking that question and saying, well, if these are the practices that produce housing, where am I in this? Where could I be in this? Where could a professional be in this? What kind of expertise or knowledge or practice could this allow? So how am I a part of this? And it links then to Vishwanath's question of what is the enterprise? What is the project? What is this new ways of practicing professionally or otherwise? So I think that, I think more than the archives of the different kinds of form, for example, that exist, which I think we do better at. I think we have done better at engaging with the diversity of those archives, and particularly at a place like C. I think that the archives of the process of production allow us an answer to the practice question, because it allows students to see for themselves what the practices are. So you can turn around and sort of say, you know what these practices of production are. Where are you in this production? Where are you in this world of the way housing is being produced? Can you imagine an entry to be part of this and part of that? So I think it's just a particular bias for me, because I find it hard to answer that question of practice when asked by students, if they have unless the archive of multiple practices already exist. Right? And so then when I'm saying, look, you can be this or this or this or this, it's more meaningful if the archive has told them that those practices actually produce housing. Yeah. So, so I'm just leaning on that archive a little bit more for its proximity to practice as a pedagogical tool, more than a conceptual tool on housing.
Yeah, I got you. Thanks.
Prasad is raising his hand. Like, Prasad, do you have a comment to make? Like, very quickly, last comment, and then we can take it.
Just a response on the question of how to handle temporalities. I think the Rohit, there is enough evidence now tying up the temporality of the house with other parallel temporalities of, say, other economies, festivals, cultures, cultural practices, weather cycles. So tying up the temporality of the house and the house form with other temporalities would be a useful way to engage with the temporality question. That's all. Thanks.
I mean, when Gautam was explaining about the archive, I was just thinking about the point that you make in your paper about, the new terms for southern urban practices. I forgot the title of the paper. There again, the disjunct between, let's say, once the archive becomes knowledge, how does it kind of link back and tie back again? Now that's again probably a dilemma. And I was thinking again to maybe would it then be equally important to kind of constantly how do you say, serially producing archives, but not necessarily rely on let's say a kind of given knowledge of this is a set of practices that one needs to kind of be part of or something like that.
And where better to do that than in the university? Exactly the structure to produce that archive year on year with a different batch. I mean, that's why I think this is the place you can do it. None of the research institutes can do it. I mean, I wish as researchers, we had the ability to create archives, not just about time, but over time. To me, it's only the university that is structurally designed to create long-term archives that keep growing and changing and adding and rechecking. And it should be the university that actually sounds the first signal saying, hey, look, we look at what work our students have produced and how we teach. There's something in the urban. But those signals don't come to us from the university right now. And they should, because it is literally the only sustainable structure I know for the constant generation of archives as the core role of the university. That offers that archive back to the city and back to practice, to speak of the role of the university, not the role of the architect.
Thanks everyone. Thanks Gautam. Thanks Vishwanath, Vastavik, all the people who attended this panel. During the lunch hour almost. Hope you did not fall asleep. We have the next panel at 3:10. So we'll take a short 5 minutes break and see you back all at 3:10. Please hang around and mute yourself. Thanks everyone. It was a pleasure to talk to you all. Fantastic. Thank you.
Young, remove me from the panelist.
I think Dipti can do that.